read the mission statement today.
LakeTran is committed to providing quality public transportation services to all Lake County residents with special emphasis on meeting the transportation needs of seniors and people with disabilities.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'm going to turn the meeting over to our legal counsel, Mr. Dines, to administer the oath of office to Mr. Zibble.
Okay. Mr. Zibble, if you would please raise your right hand. I, Charles Zibble, will honestly,
I, Charles Zibble, will honestly,
faithfully, and impartially
faithfully, and impartially
perform the duties of a trustee
perform the duties of a trustee
for LakeTran,
for LakeTran,
the Regional Transit Authority,
Regional Transit Authority,
and that I will not
and I will not
be personally interested,
be personally interested in,
either directly or indirectly,
directly or indirectly,
in any contract
any contract
which is let by LakeTran.
which is led by LakeTran.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations. Are there any public comments in the boardroom or in any virtual room? Yes. If you could please state your name for the record and keep it to maybe 3-4 minutes if that's appropriate.
Yes, very, very quickly. My name is Brian Massey with a group called Lobbyists for Citizens. We are a 501c4 organization that is interested in any and all Lake County issues. I have followed LakeTran for quite some time, as we have followed other governmental agencies and nonprofits in Lake County. I'm here today when I heard about the increase in the headquarters cost, originally from $10 million to $17.5. I have been, scanning the agenda items, so I would basically what I hope to get out of this meeting is to find out how did it get set at $10 million and how did it go from $10 million to $17.5? That is a huge difference. So somebody wasn't doing their job, and I would really like to have a clear understanding from the board how that happened and where is the money going to come from to pay for the $17.5 million headquarters. We're not even sure it's going to come in at $17.5, and if it was supposed to be 10 and now 17.5, what makes that number a good number? So I hope the board will address those concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Massey. So first I would like to start off by saying that where we're at right now with the $17.5 million project, that is a recommendation of the management of LakeTran. At this time, the board has not formally voted to adopt any sort of expansion or sign any sort of agreement to physically do this project at this time. I think my colleagues would agree that the building is 30 years old, and there's certainly something that has to be done. To what extent, that's what the ongoing discussions have been about. In terms of the timeline of how the cost went from 10 to 17, do you want to maybe provide a little bit of information on that?
Yeah, sure. I'll also be going over a little bit in the briefing paper for loan change order, so I can do it now if you'd like, or I can do it as part of that request. It's up to you.
Were you going to stick around for the?
I'll stick around for that. Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
There were no virtual comments.
Okay. At this time, is there a motion to approve the LakeTran Board of Trustees Board meeting minutes of May 24th, 2021?
So moved.
Motion made by Mr. Sheets. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion seconded by Mr. Swanson. Vicki, if you could please call the roll.
Epic,
Here.
Martin,
Yes.
McNamee,
Yes.
Nunnally,
Yes.
Sheets,
Yes.
Swanson,
Yes.
Zibble.
Abstain.
Thank you, everyone. At this time, is there a motion to approve the LakeTran Board of Trustees Board Work Session minutes of June 9th, 2021?
So moved.
Motion made by Mr. Swanson. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Ms. Nunnally. Vicki, if you could please call the roll.
Epic,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
McNamee,
Yes.
Nunley,
Yes.
Sheets,
Yes.
Swanson,
Yes.
Zibble.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. And at this time, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Lisa for the financial statement for April 2021.
Okay, thank you.
I'll do it, just tell me.
All right. Okay, so I'll be going over our operating revenues, expenses, cash balance, special transportation, and capital. And we will start with the revenue, which is on pages 11 and 12 of the Schedule B. Year-to-date total revenues are $9,353,433. We budgeted to be around $8,148,592. We're about $1.2 million more than what we had budgeted. And part of the reasons I have listed in my notes, which would be our fares are slightly down when we compare them to our budget due to the COVID, but they are gradually working their way back to normal. Sales tax revenue is actual January through April. It's up about $824,000 for the 4 months, which is about 13.2% over what we originally budgeted. Miscellaneous revenue is up over budget due to an extra workers' comp reimbursement that we got due to COVID. So our revenue received more than budget is due to the sales tax, the grant reimbursements, and the miscellaneous workers' comp extra reimbursement. So a lot of these will be, especially the grants and the miscellaneous, those are just one-time revenue sources. Those are not recurring. Revenue received more than the 2020 is due to the sales tax and the state grants. If we could go to the second page for our expenses, and our actual revenue, our actual expenses year to date, we're at $5,766,922. Our expenses that we have spent less than budget is about $1,578,000 or 21.5%. And our expenses spent less than 2020 is about $121,000. In my notes, I have listed that wages are down over 2021 budget, 2020 actual. We did pay us a new the board did pay us a new organizational chart in November 2020, increasing the staffing for the just for the I believe maintenance and some admin and. But because we weren't sure, we said we wouldn't do anything with it until we knew how things were going to set up with the COVID. So obviously not all those positions have been hired yet. Purchase transportation's down, again, basically due to COVID because we didn't know how or when it would come back, but it is gradually coming back, which is a good thing. Services are down over 2020 due to one-time cost of elections. Services are down compared to the 2021 budget due to timing of payments. So like, for example, the audit started earlier this year, so obviously we're paying more payments out versus last year. We always have this, we always have some timing issues there on how we pay things out. Supplies are down due to spending less on dial-ride parts in 21 versus 20. And then I just wanted to remind everybody around the middle of March 2020 last year is when we shut down. So you will see our numbers will be up and down, just because of all this stuff going on. All right, if we can move on to the third slide, which basically is just a summary of our revenue and expenses based on our Schedule Bs, which are on pages 11 and 12. So obviously our total revenues year to date are $9,353,433. Our total operating expenses year to date is $5,766,922. And then our capital expenses, we do get grants, and we try to get as many grants as we can to help pay for those, but we also have to have a local contribution in most cases, and so far this year we're at about $2,113,683 we've spent in 21 for our local contribution, giving us an income before depreciation of about $1,472,828. And then obviously we have depreciation expenses, those are estimated currently, and gives us a net income of around $112,828. Cash balance. So our operating cash balance, we keep at about $8,507,449, and we do that, it's about 5 months worth of expenses, and that's based on last year's expenses. Our headquarters building, we had estimated, I mean, we just put some cash aside. I mean, we really didn't put the cash aside, but this is what we're anticipating. Right now, we have about $12 million to be able to put towards that. Our regular cash obligations for our capital that we still have to pay for that has been approved is about $6.3 million. Kind of gives you an idea, and I kind of broke down the cash piece for the headquarters. And a lot of that comes, we've got 3 different types of funding for grants that are one-time grants only. So, and that all had to do with the COVID, and that was the CARES Act, the CRISA, and the American Rescue Plan. And the next slide is our STS, revenue and expenses. This will be special, the STS stands for Special Transportation Services. So far, of course, for this year, we had a lot of seniors that use this, and obviously due to the COVID, they have not used it too much. We are slowly getting back into that also. So far this year, we have a total revenue of about $2,566,000. Our expenses are about $24,185, giving us that we spent less, around $14,811. Let me back up. The $2,566 for revenue. Revenues received less than budgets, about $12,874. And then on the expense side, you're at $24,185, and we've spent about $14,811, less than what we had anticipated. But we have fixed costs, and so that's why you're always going to see your expenses on this one being slightly higher. So you have to pay insurance whether you operate or don't. You have to pay to store the buses whether you operate or don't. So our first year of operations for STS was in 2019, and then obviously due to the COVID, there has been very low need for these services, but we are slowly getting back into that since we are allowed to be out and about more. And we're anticipating that we'll be doing more of this towards the end of the year. And my final is capital projects, which is in page 18 of the board packet. Kind of shows you the federal portion, the local portion, and the state portion. And again, nothing in 21, 22, well, 21, most of that's been approved. 22, 23, 24, and 25, those are just projections. And this is kind of our overall 5-year projection on capital on what we're estimating. And those will change. There's no question that 2022, 23, 24, and 25. Right now, we've just kind of put those in there as earmarks for things that we know or things that we may have been awarded grants for already. And that will conclude unless anybody has any questions.
Are there any questions for Lisa? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the financial statement for April 2021, subject to audit?
So made.
Motion made by Mr. Zibble. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Epic. Vicki, if you could please call the roll.
Epic,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
McNamee,
Yes.
Nunnally,
Yes.
Sheets,
Yes.
Swanson,
Yes.
Yes.
Did you hear me? Sorry.
Zibble,
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. And at this time, it looks like we're going to talk about some grant applications.
Yes. So good evening, everyone. Tonight I will be asking the board to authorize LakeTran to apply for federal grants for federal fiscal year 2022. This is a routine request. We come before the board every year to request this authorization. We do this kind of in one batch for the entire year because the grant cycle is always changing. And sometimes we don't have a lot of time to actually write and submit grants. For example, last year in 2020, FTA released a research grant and we had 30 days to write it and submit it. So there's not always a lot of time to come before the board every time there's a grant we want to apply for. So we ask for this authority ahead of time so that we have the ability to apply for grants that we're eligible for as needed. The federal fiscal year begins on October 1st and ends on September 30th. We use grant funding to do a lot of things, capital projects. We fund our capitalized maintenance program, buses, and we maintain a state of good repair in our fleet and facilities. These are the typical FTA grant programs that we apply for on an annual basis. There are formula grants that Congress apportions through legislation to urbanized areas annually. So the Urbanized Area Formula Program, Bus and Bus Facilities, and Section 5310 are formula programs that LakeTran receives federal dollars from. There's also competitive grant programs. We compete nationally with other transit agencies across the country in the competitive grants. In federal fiscal year 2021, we received over $19 million in federal funding, but a majority of that is from one-time funding due to pandemic relief, so the CRISA and the American Rescue Plan. So really, we anticipate for 2022 that the kind of the 4 other grants would be what we would anticipate roughly that LakeTran would be applying for. So in conclusion, we apply for all grants for which we are eligible and for which we have a need. We use grant fundings to support capital improvement, purchase buses, and perform capitalized maintenance on our fleet and facilities. I recommend approval of the attached resolution, which will also authorize the CEO and his designee to file applications on behalf of LakeTran for all federal grants in federal fiscal year 2022. Are there any questions?
Real quick, I want to add to what Andrea said. You go to this slide. Federal grants can be kind of complicated in the way we talk about them. So when we talk about applying for a grant, depending on the type, there could be 2 actual application processes. So where you see formula, that is, we don't necessarily go out and request that. We don't go out and say, hey, LakeTran needs to do X, Y, and Z, can you give us these dollars? The feds every year have an allocation, and we essentially get a spreadsheet that says, LakeTran will receive X, Y, and Z. We then submit an application, which is more of a bureaucratic step to receive the money. So we still say we applied for it, but we didn't have to justify the need, explain why we want it. We didn't really have to do any of those steps. That's just the feds say, this is your share of the money that Congress allocates towards buses. So that requires us to submit what we would call as one application. So we submit the application that says, yes, we would like to have that money, and we receive it. There's not a competition, there's not any other process. So that's the first type. And so that's, even though we say apply, it's more of a formality versus what you traditionally think of as like a grant where you're going out and saying, hey, I need this and this is why. Those are competitive grants. So those are still federal dollars, and those are allocated to the whole country. So we go through a process to request those dollars, to say, hey, like for bus and bus facilities, we might say, hey, we need 10 buses. These are why we need 10 buses. And we go through an application process to the feds to justify that request. They then will say, you won or you didn't win. And once that happens, then they allocate the money to us, and we apply for it a second time in the bureaucratic way. So if it's a competitive process, we actually apply for it twice. If it's a formula process, we receive it once. But when we talk about applying for grants, you still are submitting an application each time. So that's kind of a weird process. That's just how the federal government lays out the process. So like, for example, all of the different stimulus bills we got this year and last year, those were all formulas. We didn't go out and say, please give us this, we need it very badly. The Fed said, this is how much money you get. They sent a spreadsheet with a dollar amount on it. We submit the paperwork, they give us the dollars. So an example of a competitive grant we've gotten in the past is a low-no grant where we asked for electric buses. We competed against other people nationally to receive those funds. And then once they said, you are a winner, we apply for them again. So it's a weird process, but it sometimes can be confusing, especially, we live this every day, and you guys hear about it every once in a while. So I wanted to just take a second to explain that because it is sort of odd.
So do we, as a board, see the grant again, or the grant application again before it's put in? Or are we, at this point, saying, essentially, here's a blank check, chase these grants, or the grants that you think are appropriate? Does the board have another say on these grants?
So the formula grants, no, because they're pretty standard. Lisa includes them in the budget, so you'll see what we think we're gonna get. If it's a competitive grant, if it's a program that the board hasn't been made aware of, we would talk about it. And you would approve it at some point because it would be coming through a capital process. Usually for bus grants, we don't tell the board we're applying for a bus grant until we hear if we want one or not. And then you would approve the use of those funds when we do the procurement. So you wouldn't be approving each individual grant request, but you would ultimately approve the use of the funds. And the main reason for that is sometimes the feds, they change the schedule, or they say, hey, this grant is due in 30 days, and one of the things that's required of all of these grants is a board resolution. So it's not really possible to submit every grant through the board. We would actually lose the opportunity to apply for something because we wouldn't have a resolution to go with the application. So every year we request authority from the board to do this for both federal and state grants.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Is there a motion to approve the resolution to authorize the CEO and/or his designee to file applications, accept and execute contracts, and any other information pertaining to any and all federal grants for federal fiscal year 2022?
So moved.
Motion made by Ms. McNamee. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Zibble. Vicki, if you could please call the roll.
Epic,
Yes.
Martin,
Yes.
McNamee,
Yes.
Nunnally,
Yes.
Sheets,
Yes.
Swanson,
Yes.
Zibble.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. At this time, I will turn the meeting over to Beck.
Brian? So, in my time here, there's things that I really love bringing to the board and saying, hey, look at this great thing we're gonna do, we're gonna save money, propane buses, electric buses. There's other things that I think to myself, man, is there anything else that I could be doing right now? And this is one of those. So I wanna go through a little bit of the history of where we're at with the headquarters project. So, in 2019, well, let me go back. When the board discussed putting a levy on the ballot as early as September of 2018, one of the issues that we would be faced if the levy were to pass was a lack of space for dial-a-ride buses specifically and some staff. So we discussed that at our board retreat in September of 2018. We said, well, this isn't something we need to worry about until we find out what happens. But it's something that we need to be aware of because it is a potential threat in the future. So the board voted to put a levy on the ballot. It was ultimately successful in 2019. Immediately after that, we began the process of saying, how much would this project cost? What would we need to do to try and store the buses we envision needing in the future? So we hired CT consultants. We've worked with them in the past on lots of projects. And we sat down with them and we did a couple things. We did sort of a conceptual budget, what we think the right amount was based on the scope. We also did a study to make sure that we had enough land and space here to accommodate the buses and expanding the garage. So we wanted to make sure first, is this technically feasible? And two, if it is, how much do we think it would cost? We as staff are great at running buses, but construction is something that we do sometimes. But for something like this, we thought it was appropriate to seek an outside opinion and tell us, hey, how much would this cost? So we sat down with CT consultants in late 2019, early 2020, and said, this is what we need to do. How much do you think, in your professional opinion as a company, should this cost us? So they put together a conceptual budget estimate that came to a board meeting in, I think, January of 2020, and presented to the board what their conceptual estimate was for the project. At the time, the total cost was $12,490,000. That included the design process. So within that amount was roughly $10 million for actual construction, $9 million for the building with $1 million of contingency. Based on that, Lisa and I, mainly Lisa, really pretty much all Lisa, because you don't want me doing this, worked up some financial options for the board to discuss. We said, hey, at the time, how do we want to fund this? We want to fund this with cash, a combination of cash and loans, or all loans. So the board looked at those options and ultimately decided that cash was the best fit for the project. With that in mind, we went through a procurement process, hired R&L Bowen and Associates. CT Consultants has done a lot of work for us in the past. They're an excellent firm. I have a lot of respect for them, and we have a great working relationship with them. However, R.L. Bowen really has a lot of history and specialization in the design of transit facilities. So when we did the evaluation process, even though we like CT, we have a great relationship with them, we said, this project is in the wheelhouse of R.L. Bowen. They designed garages for CODA, they designed garages for SARTA, they have a lot of experience in transit facilities. So the board approved a contract with R.L. Bowen in February of 2020 for the design of the building. In March of 2020, the first stay-at-home orders were issued, and we ended up canceling the March board meeting. We did ultimately, in the April board meeting, approve a construction administration piece for Bowen, bringing their total agreement with us to around $1.2 million. The design piece was right around $980,000. Construction management was right around $250,000. So the board approved both of those contracts very close to each other, and those are what R.L. Bowen has been working under all of this time. They completed their conceptual design in July of 2020, their schematic design in September of 2020, and their design development in March of 2021. So those three things are just steps that the engineers and architects go through, and quite honestly, board member Zibble could probably explain the intricacies of each one a little better than me, if anyone has a question about what those are. And they gave updates to the board sort of as they went. So when we hired R.L. Bowen, we were relying on the numbers we got from CT to be what we expected the project to cost. That was the number that we had gotten a professional opinion about. That was the number that we had discussed a lot with the board at the time. So when we hired them, we said that's how much we expect to spend. Basically, when Bowen started, they created an estimate there's basically an estimate is created in each phase of the design process. So when they finished the schematic design process, they said, your budget is $21 million. And I said, good Lord, that is very different. That's not going to work. We're going to have to, we need to reduce that. I wouldn't even bring that number to the board and say, hey, I think we should spend $21 million. So we worked with Bowen for a while to value engineer things out of the project, and we ultimately cut about $3 million in scope out of the work. After we did that, Bowen came in to present to the board, and the first presentation they did, they presented a budget right around $17.5 to $18 million. The second time they presented to the board, they presented what is their current estimate, which is exactly $18,067. Keep in mind, or $18,067,713. Keep in mind, these are estimates and they can change. Since that initial presentation, we have worked hard with them to cut even more out of the budget, and we're right now at about 17.5. So we have been trying hard to cut as much as we can out of the project through different things, by reducing scope or reducing the way something was built. We talked about this in the work session, but a good example is originally Bowen designed the bus storage facility to be all concrete block from the ground to the roof. We said, hang on, we can do this cheaper, we can do concrete up to a certain height in sort of the crash zone, and then metal above that to reduce costs. So as we've gone on, we've worked to reduce the cost of the project because we don't want to spend as much money as Bowen has told us. Bowen has done a really good job so far trying to keep those costs under control with sort of the idea in mind that it's really good to make the project as cheap as possible, but certain things you don't want to buy the absolute cheapest product because it will cause you to spend more in your operating in the long term. So, a good idea, or a good way to think about that is the coverings or the materials chosen in a bathroom. If you put wallpaper in a certain place, it may not hold up as well as if you put tile there. So they've done a good job balancing that, because obviously we don't want to build the garage mahal, but we want to build something that will be, of a high enough quality that will last long term. This building was built with that same mindset, so that you have a long-term quality building that, I'll pick on school systems a little bit. You don't tear down and build a new building every 50 years like a lot of the schools tend to do. You want to keep the building in good shape for a long period of time, just like you keep your house. And so when Bowen negotiated their fee, it is common in the architecture and design world to use a percentage of the budget to establish a fee. I do not care for that methodology, but it is part of the industry standard process that is used. So when Bowen negotiated their contract amount, they were basing it on the $9 million that the project was estimated to cost at the time. They presented to the board several times the higher number, and the board has generally said, let's continue with the process. So we have acknowledged the fact that the budget is higher, and so now Bowen has asked for an increase in their fee based on the higher budget. This is a challenge for us. I went back, and one of the things we did was, okay, you're asking for more money, let's compare this to other projects and where things generally are. So we took a look at the two other projects we completed recently, the Frank J. Political Transit Center at Lakeland and the Whitcliffe Park and Ride in Whitcliffe. Unfortunately, these aren't complete apples to apples because both of those facilities have electric bus charging in them, which require a much higher engineering load than a building like this does, so the design fees were much higher. Industry standard in the transit world, we kind of reached out to some of our peers, is between 10 and 23, 24, kind of that mid-20s percentage number is what we heard. The challenge with transit projects is they're all very technical and they're all very different, so it's not always easy to get a really, really good sort of apples to apples. But from what we learned, between 10 and mid-20s or low to mid-20s is acceptable. So our original agreement with Bowen was at 13%, which is a really great rate. We specifically negotiated a sort of flat agreement. This is the price. Hopefully that's all we need for the project. So we negotiated a good rate in the design process, especially compared with our previous projects. But I wanted to put up here, I know I included a letter as part of the board packet with Bowen's actual request in it. I sort of tweaked it a little bit based on the official numbers they've given us, not the sort of things we've been working at to reduce. So if the board were to approve this, their total design fee would be at 8%, which is below our peers, below industry standard, which is a pretty good thing. I don't know if Chuck has any other additions to that specific number or percentage that might be relevant.
My only comment on that is that the original 13% is probably a very good percentage for what they were going to be looking at, because it is a renovation job, so design fees generally go higher than that, or get around to that 13%. So them coming in now at 8%, that seemed to me to be a very reasonable place to be.
So, thank you, Chuck. So we took all that into consideration and said, how do we evaluate this request? because it's not necessarily an easy request for me to evaluate. You know, usually when we look at our own internal statistics, you know, half of Matt's job is dealing with data, and we can evaluate how much it costs to send a bus to do this, and how much it costs per hour, and all those different things. So we said, okay, how do we evaluate a request like this to determine if it's something that I should bring to the board, or if it's something that I should just say, get out of here? So we did our best to really think about this objectively and say, what is the right thing to do? And so the scope of the project has really remained the same the whole time. We haven't made any major changes to what we have wanted to do since we first talked with CT. We had a very sort of clear idea of the things that needed to be done in a cost-effective way, so that, you know, we're not rebuilding the building, but we're making, you know, smart sort of tactical changes to facilitate LakeTran's needs for the next 30 years. The budget change, you know, is none of us like it. So far, it kind of, I don't want to say it is what it is, because that's never the case, but again, we haven't made any changes in the scope. We're seeing, you know, opinions from CT saying you can do it for this much money, and an opinion from Bowen saying you can do it for this much money. CT did not go through an actual design process, they just did an estimate. They sort of conceptualized what we wanted to do and said, this is how much we think that will cost. But they didn't come in, they didn't do engineering on the building, they didn't say, you know, this air duct is here, this structural column is here, you know, these things are going to add up. Bowen has done that. So Bowen, in two ways, Bowen has had the opportunity to really do a detailed process to understand what's going on. And two, their specialty is transit garages. There's no real viable metric that's available to us to validate whether the request is appropriate or not, other than, is this percentage in line with other projects, which you saw, we did that analysis, and it's lower than other projects and even than a lot of industry things. So we reached out to Brandon and said, hey, Brandon, what does the contract say? Are we in, you know, shaky grounds? Are we in safe territory? Where are we at? And we are protected with our current contract, sort of no matter what the board decides. So then we said, hey, you know, we have an expert on our board, Mr. Zibbel. So I think many of you know, but if you don't, you know, Chuck's was in the industry for 42 years and ran Burgess and Nyepel. So I was like, well, thank goodness, I have an expert that I can call. And he basically, I don't want to take words out of your mouth, but agreed with me. It's like, there's not a great metric for this. And so him and I sat and talked about this and sort of lamented that for a while in my office about, you know, hey, this process is not great. What should we do? Are these numbers in line with each other? And, you know, you look like you have, you're scooting closer, so how do we try?
The other thing I was going to mention, Ben, in the conversations that you and I have had, was that fee-based upon construction is very difficult sometimes to comprehend. But you did give them a very good scope of services that I thought that they needed to work with, and they knew what they needed to design to. So the cost, the extras I saw in this was a lot of the evaluation again of more detail of what was going to be designed and how much those things were going to cost. And going back again and reviewing the contract or the cost estimate with us and doing that 2 or 3 times, talking to you guys about some additional changes to the scope of the work also. So they have, in my opinion, they probably have done some things above and beyond what they originally would have scoped for their project. So there is some justification in my mind for this. Again, as far as the cost of construction, we all know the construction costs are kind of starting to go out of sight anyway at this point, just because of the way the materials are. A piece of lumber's gone up about 300%, so it's not going to be good. And you really can't decide some of those numbers at the very preliminary scope, because you don't delve into the items deep enough to know, do I need to replace the item, do I need to just repair it, or is it an easy fix or not?
Thanks, Chuck. So after all of that, we sat there and said, what should I bring to this board for consideration? You know, this has to be realistic and sort of, you know, pass the sniff test, I guess. My immediate reaction is I don't think that I should give them or consider giving them their full request. I think that, you never start off negotiations with the exact spot you want to be. So we looked at a range, and ultimately, when we talked about this, Chuck and I a little bit, we said, right in that 250 range is appropriate based on the scope of the project. Well, not the scope, but the budget. And the one thing that, we kind of, it was actually something my team brought up to me, and they said, hey, if we had gone out with an $18 million budget originally, then ask Boa what their fee would have been. And they responded by saying it would have been $2.2 million. So, in a way, what we did is incredibly frustrating to me. But at the same time, it's unintentional consequences that we're getting sort of a higher bang for our buck because they're coming in with a smaller increase than what it would have cost if we had thought the project was $18 million to begin with. So I wouldn't want to do that to a vendor intentionally because that's kind of dirty, but it is kind of what it is at that point. And so with sort of all that in mind, they put this request in April, and you guys say it's now June. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what the right answer was on this item. My team probably was sick of me talking about it at staff meeting. But I think that ultimately why I'm here tonight is because, we gave them a number when we hired them, which was the $9 million number. And so we have some sort of, I don't think liability is the word that Brandon would want me to use, but quote unquote liability, and we gave them a number and it was wrong. It wasn't because Ben and my team said, this is the number we think is best. Things changed, adjustments happened, and the number is higher. And so none of us like it. I don't like it. I don't like being here tonight to have this conversation. But at the same time, reality is reality. And so ultimately, I think that, we do have a little bit of skin in the game. If we didn't, I would have said, tough bananas, Bowen, you didn't estimate this right. You didn't plan well enough. This is on you. But because we gave them a number, part of it, in my opinion, is on us. And that's why I'm here tonight to request this approval. And I think it's the appropriate thing to do to keep the project moving forward. But it's certainly one of those things that, it's kind of like when you have to replace the furnace in your house or your air conditioner. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody says, yay, my furnace went out. I don't have heat in the winter. But you don't have that much of a choice. So this is not exactly the same because it's not life or death. But it has that similar feeling where, it's sort of your car breaks. You don't want to fix it because you don't want to spend the money on it. And this is that, it's right here in that kind of place. So that's kind of the history of how we got where we are today. And ultimately that's, my recommendation is to increase their contract by $250,000. That does include both design and construction administration. So this is a one-time increase. They're not coming back to the board. Even if they ask for it, they're not coming back to the board. This is it. This is over. This is done. This will carry us through the end of the project. So that is where I'm at today. And I don't know if anybody has any questions. I tried to do my best to summarize everything, but I'm certainly happy to talk more about it or answer questions or anything like that.
So we're basing this increase on numbers that they generated?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do we have a way to confirm that?
To confirm their estimates, we could hire another independent party to confirm whether those estimates are correct. We did, when the budget was increased originally, we did ask CT Consultants to review it in comparison with their numbers. We got a letter back from them saying that they thought it was sort of in line. But that was when the budget sort of first went up. We haven't done that again for a little while. So that is an option that exists.
So do we understand why CT was, I'm still uncomfortable why there's this discrepancy. How can these numbers be that far off with professional organizations that do this all the time? Who missed what, or who is continuing to miss what?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I share your frustration. I don't know. I don't like that we had to change, that there's a change upon us. You know, I thought when we hired CT to give us a number, we were doing the best due diligence we could do by hiring a professional to tell us. And I can't get a clear answer as to, you know, why there's a major difference. You know, one of the differences, CT did their analysis without doing detailed design, which makes a big difference because you don't know all the things you're kind of working with. But I don't have a great answer for why they're so different. I can say that we have gone through Bowen's estimate with a fine-tooth comb, and we don't see anything in it that looks inappropriate. The only thing that we saw that we kind of questioned was the ventilation expense, which we took out, and we went out to bid separately for that. And that was really the only thing we said, this seems odd. But everything else, we went through line by line, looking at materials and square footages, and all of it sort of seems right. CT's estimate doesn't have that kind of detail for us to evaluate. So.
Did CT go through that kind of detail in their estimate in the first place?
No, because it was a conceptual estimate. We didn't actually hire them to do, you wouldn't be able to have access to that without doing the actual engineering and design, and that's not what we hired them to do.
But the scope hasn't changed dramatically from them. I mean, essentially, they're still going to design and engineer the same relative spaces, correct?
Yes, we as staff have not altered our objectives from the beginning.
How far down the road are they on that?
Bowen? They are in the last phase of design, so they've been working on it for about a year now. They're in the construction drawing phase, which is where they prepare the documents for the contractors to bid on.
So their work is basically done.
It's close to done. The design process kind of continues through the bidding process. So when we go out to get bids from contractors, they will review those bids to make sure they are matching the scope, and then they will recommend award to a certain contractor based on meeting the scope and being the lowest price. And that's kind of when the design process ends and gets handed off to construction administration.
And they're doing that also?
Yes.
Is that typical?
You can do it both ways. This way is cheaper. But we've used it, CT did it for us in the past for all our previous projects, and we have found it valuable because they are able to really know what's in the drawings versus having, you can hire a third party to be your sort of owner's representative. That comes with an additional cost, and it's usually a higher cost. So by having Bowen manage it, they kind of intimately know their drawings, and they can be our advocate for low cost. Lane?
I just don't get it either. Just what Gary said, I heard you say then at least 2 or 3 times during your presentation, the scope hasn't changed. I just can't get my arms around how one professional firm can say something is $9 or $12 million and another professional firm, estimate or no estimate. These people do this all the time. I mean, can come back and say, well, it was 21, now it's only 18 million. What? I just can't get any understanding in my mind why those numbers are so different for the same thing. The scope hasn't changed. I just don't get it. And adding, if they've already gone through all of their work almost, and now they're coming back and asking for another $300,000 for work they've already done? I'm sorry, I don't understand that either. And why did they wait till now? I mean, they were doing all this work. They couldn't see that they're going along with this project, and then all of a sudden, this thing comes out to be twice what we thought it was. I thought the $9 million was twice what it should be. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. And I don't see paying them another $300,000 for something that they're 99% done with, or whatever the percentage is. We have a contract, they should stick to it.
Yeah, I certainly, Lane, I totally share your frustration, and I know
It's not frustration, Ben. It's logic,
well,
clear logic.
I share your frustration and logic. And we certainly don't like having to deal with this. I will say they submitted it a little bit maybe later than I would have thought, but they did submit their request in April. Part of the time between then and now was me negotiating with them and trying to go through a process to determine if we should even consider this. So part of the delay is on me because I didn't want to just bring it in here and say, hey, they want this, let's give it to them. But I understand your frustration, and I feel the same about why is the price different between these two firms. I hate to put Chuck on the spot again, but maybe he can, I don't know if you have anything to add.
The only thing I would add to that, Lane, in your response to your question there, your comment, is that there's two different methodologies that go on when you do the conceptual design and you get into the design itself. Conceptual design, again, you just say, okay, I got so many square feet of this building, and building types of this type, we see by this estimating agency that's out there all the time, out there that we use, it should be this many dollars per square foot. So if it's $10 a square foot, that's what we put into the estimate, and then that works its way through. So then you come up with that kind of a number of $10 million. Then you get into your design process where you start to look at it in much more detail, and you say, okay, yes, I have 50 square feet of space that I want to remodel, but that includes having to tear down the walls now, put up new block walls. I've got to maybe expand some of the space. I have to change some of the heating and ventilating. Oh yeah, now the heating and ventilating unit I find out is not up to code or not up to the snuff to continue to work in that area. So you go out and you get actual contract pricing from suppliers of this type of equipment, and that just adds into your estimate as it goes along, and it can creep up a little bit.
But isn't that what contingency's about, typically?
Contingencies, yes, should cover a lot of that. But back at the beginning, there was like a 15% contingency, I think it was. And then as they moved through this, they started at 20% contingency and kept on going through it, and it's come down as it goes along. But as you refine that number, more and more that contingency amount should come down. So if you want to say anything, it would be maybe that CT didn't come in and say we have a 100% contingency fund, factor on that, which would have been kind of a crazy thing to have anyway.
Right. So, I can understand, to Lane's point, I can understand where perhaps CT was playing at just a conceptual and didn't get in far enough into the detail to hit the number very particularly closely. So they undershot it. Okay, I can understand that. Where I get sort of tripped up here is Bowen is, they specialize in this, right? This is where they live. This is their space. If they're that good, wouldn't they have seen this being that far off almost immediately? Instead of sometime down the road, wouldn't they have been able, if I'm not sure I can explain this, but if CT was that far off the mark, then somebody who lives in that space should be able to say really early on in their process, well, wait a second, these guys really missed the mark. We need to talk about this. Wouldn't that be the case, typically?
Well, I think they did. Maybe you can help me a little bit with some of the dates here, but CT came in December of 19, I think you said, and Bowen got hired in 20, and as soon as they got started, by the end of the year 20, we were already aware that the price was going to go way up. So in their schematic design phase, there's 3 phases: schematic, design, development, and construction documents, and they get more refined as they go through. So when they were still in their schematic design space, they realized that the cost was going way up, and they did come talk to us about it at that time.
Yeah, it was about, I think it was about April of 2020. Was it that long ago, Andrea? Do you remember when it was? I can't remember the date.
Schematic design was completed in like September of 2020. And to your point, Gary, during the interview process for these firms, I believe we interviewed 4 firms, and we asked them that question. And we had this estimate from CT Consultants, you know, how comfortable are you to, you know, does that seem like a reasonable number? And the firms that we interviewed said, yes, but we really won't know till we get into the work. So they didn't say it was, oh, absolutely. They said, it seems reasonable, but, you know, we haven't seen everything, that, you know, we haven't done the design. So it was something that, you know, LakeTran was thinking about during the interview phase.
And I understand that. What I don't understand is going from 9 million to 21 million, or 10 million to 21, being off by 100%. And it seems like everybody was off by 100%. But it just, as an outsider looking into this stuff, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around that. I just don't understand how you get that far off, and how we get a year down the road before we start talking about an addition to their fee.
Well,
I mean, I understand a little bit of delay while you did your homework, that's a good thing. I agree with that 100%. But it just seems to me like this is awful late to be bringing this up.
yeah, I think you're right. It was, they mentioned that they might request more money at a point. And I said, well, you need to put that in writing. Not just gonna, you know, you can't just say, hey, toss me some extra cash on the side. Like, that's not how this game is played. And I couldn't tell you why it took them so long to officially submit a request to us, because they had kind of grumbled about it in the past. But I don't know why they waited so long. I don't have a good answer.
And one thing I haven't heard here is what has been stated in terms of these additional fees. Has that been broken down to include materials? Is there an impact from the increase in construction costs alone that we have seen? And they're still creeping up because of the pandemic and supply shortages and so on?
Yeah, I don't think they've taken necessarily supply shortages into consideration, but there certainly is the COVID effect in these numbers. You know, CT's numbers were pre-COVID, Bowen's numbers have been through COVID. So there's certainly a percentage of the construction cost estimate that is due to inflation and COVID inflation. So
Bowen, go ahead.
I don't know what percentage of the increase is related to COVID inflation, but I have to imagine, and we've had a discussion, I had a discussion with Bo, and I said, is this still the right time to do this project? You know, construction materials are at a premium right now. Should we wait because they're gonna come down? And their answer was like, no, you know, they're only gonna get worse. You know, yeah, lumber might start to come down, but ultimately inflation is inflation, and the longer you wait, the more it's gonna cost you. Then they joked with me and they said, you don't have a whole lot of lumber in your project anyway, stop worrying about lumber. And I said, okay, fine. But yeah, there certainly is the COVID effect going on here in the materials.
Well, as far as this doubling in the amount, has anyone broken that down so that we can all see where exactly the increase in costs are and what they are covering?
Yeah, that was part of when Bowen presented their opinion on why costs were different to the board. They had a breakdown by each sort of segment of the project, and it was very evenly spread over each kind of area.
And when was that?
It was last year, I forget what month, well, probably around September when they presented schematic design. I'd have to double check.
Have they redone that, or is that something that has been updated? Is that something you can bring in and show us again so that we can see where exactly these costs are and perhaps gain a better understanding of it?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very detailed cost estimate from the end of the schematic design development phase that exists. The most accurate estimate will be the one that they produce at the end of the construction drawings phase, because that's the number. When we go to bid, we have to we can't be outside of a certain number with the engineers or architects based on Ohio Revised Code. So that's gonna be the most accurate number, but they have continued to say it should be at that, you know, just a little bit below 17.5 million. But we do have a breakdown of where all those costs are for, you know,
To account for the number we're looking at today?
yes. We have a very, very detailed breakdown.
Do we have that same breakdown from CT?
No. Because they hadn't gone through the design process, they didn't have, you know, that has like quantities of flooring or.
When we come up with an estimate, they have had to do something.
They
You said that the scope hasn't changed. They had to go through and say, well, here, this is this much, this is this much. And by the way, I've spent 11 years as a design engineer, so I know a little bit about what I'm talking about. So, and I've also been involved with some very heavy, expensive construction projects for my condo development too. I mean, they were not this size, but, you know, $400,000 is a pretty good number. I just have so much problem with this whole process. And that's, I think we ought to postpone it, frankly. Till we get better numbers from some different firms, if that's what we have to do.
And what are the risks if we would postpone it? What is the risk in terms of what kind of money could LakeTran lose?
It isn't so much that we would lose money, it's that every year there's an inflationary factor on construction. And so the typical amount you plan for increase over a year is about 4%. So if we said we're going to wait the next period of time, the project would increase by roughly 4%. So the longer we wait, the more it will cost essentially.
What is the estimate conceptually from the time ground is broken, so to speak, the beginning of construction begins? Has anyone produced an estimate of how long it will take this construction to be completed?
It's approximately 18 months.
And where is our operations in terms of dial-a-ride in that mix? Because one of my concerns is that continued delays on this, that we also need about 18 months to purchase buses for the increase in passengers that is going to take place as the county ages. And I'm concerned about having the drivers, the buses, and the facilities for these buses as we're required to do if this is delayed in a significant way.
Yeah,
So how do we balance this out?
So I think, just so the board remembers, we have delayed it once already. Our original schedule was to be awarding a contract at the April 2021 board meeting. And we said, hey, let's wait a little bit. We want to, see how things go with COVID. We want to wait a little bit. So we have delayed the project once. There is certainly some risk in delaying the project in terms of expenses going up. Also with, we don't, dial-a-ride is returning. It will be back. If I had to put money on it, by the end of this year, it's probably going to be back close to what it was in previous years.
Pre-COVID?
Yeah, it's going to be close. I can't, I don't have a crystal ball, but dial-a-ride is returning, and dial-a-ride is the reason that this project even exists. And so there is some risk to wait because dial-a-ride could eclipse, if it continues to grow at the rate it was growing pre-pandemic, if we recover and then go up again, which, when we look at the aging population in Lake County, it's certainly, going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. There is some risk that we wouldn't have the facility to support the expanded dial-a-ride that we sort of promised as part of the levy. But I can't ultimately say exactly when that will be. But in theory, if the board were to stay on schedule and award a contract in September, groundbreaking would be November of this year, which would see a completion in, mid-23, which the pandemic will be pretty far in our rearview mirror at that point, with regard to dial-a-ride. So, I think, but, I can't say for sure, but so there is some risk.
Based on your projections, though, those are, as we know it today, accurate numbers.
Yes, I think so, yes, to the best of my ability.
Okay, here's another question that is concerning me. Pre-passage of the levy, we had so many on dial-a-ride. People couldn't get through on the phones to CSRs to make reservations. You couldn't get across the county on a non-ADA trip, which LakeTran is required to give those of us who are ADA certified without being denied the ride. The denials were horrific. At that point in time, just as an example, my mother was in Ultra Care in Mentor that was just outside of the ADA. The only way I could get out to see her, and there were some days I couldn't even do what I'm about to explain, coming from Willoughby, and I am on an ADA route, I had to go out, usually it was out around Lowe's or where Kohl's is, that plaza area, and then from there, that was an ADA trip. From there, it was a shorter run, and there was a better chance they could find a bus that could take me that extra, it was 1.5 miles. And I essentially had to do it was like a plane trip. I had to lay over. And I was not the only one that was impacted by this. Many people were not able to get rides. And I am very concerned where this is going down the road, that if we get this carried into 24, 25, we are going to have an impact here on our ability to get people to their destinations. And we're talking about people with disabilities and the elderly. And my question is, how do we balance that out? How do we not create an impact on them when the levy, the purpose of that levy was to resolve this situation with dial-a-ride? That was our #1 challenge, and the thing that we promised to not just the people, but all these agencies that serve these people.
Sure, I mean, like I said, I think we all remember that the dial-a-ride was not in a good place prior to the levy. It was the reason we went on the ballot. Not something that we necessarily wanted to do, but that we wanted to let the community know, hey, there could be an issue. So dial-a-ride is going to come back to what it was, and it's going to eclipse where it was pre-pandemic. I just can't say exactly when that's going to happen.
Then how far can we go in serving more passengers with the current facility, especially in terms of the fact of having room for the people we hired and the federal requirement to keep these buses undercover?
Yeah, I think that really, I understand your point, Don, and I think it's a good one, but I think, in a way, completing the project and approving this increase are separate. And so I think for right now, we really want to focus on the merits of this request. But I think that I'm sure some surveys of customers will take place in the strategic planning process, and that may be the time to maybe ask those questions. But we can say definitively that the dial-a-ride is going to come back. It's just a matter of exactly when that happens. And my professional opinion is that it will come back in the next couple years, and that the need for the storage of the additional buses will occur in the next 2 to 3 years. And so which is why I'm here today to even bring this request here for approval, because I think that the prudent thing to do, one, for the sake of doing the project as cheaply as possible with, given the scope, and to avoid more inflation, and two, because Dial-A-Ride will return. And so I think that keeping the project on the current schedule, even though we delayed it from the initial schedule, is still the right course of action. And as much as it pains me, all the reasons that I've sort of explained to you tonight, I think that awarding Bowen some additional funds is appropriate. And so that's kind of, I think, you know, the decision before the board.
And I know you want to get back specifically to this and move away from the bigger project at this point, but I thought from the work meeting that we had, we established, maybe I misunderstood it, that it's not a requirement that the buses be under shelter. Did I misunderstand that?
No, there is not a regulation per se that requires it. There are a lot of best practices and operational reasons why it is.
Understood, but we're not required to keep the buses under, I mean, that is not a limiting factor for growth in and of itself.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
It has an impact on the life of the buses, though.
Bill, it looks like you had a statement.
Yeah, but I just had one question. What happens today if we don't approve the $250,000? They have to continue on with the project as contracted?
There are a couple different outcomes that could occur. One of them is there is a clause in the contract that would let them say, hey, we're done, we're not going to do any more work. There is a clause in the contract about disputes where we would enter mediation. Or they could say, well, that's not great, we're going to keep going. So those are kind of the three options that exist. They haven't sort of really firmly said which one they would go with. I think they want to keep that close to the chest because they're hoping we approve the project tonight. You know, if they told me, hey, we'll keep going, it would be a lot of motivation for the board to consider any action.
And then is that amount in any way negotiable?
I think that as the board, you have the ultimate stick. So you could say, hey, you asked for 312, we're going to give you 150. So I think the board can say whatever number that they would feel comfortable with.
And then, Chuck, maybe you could chime in as well, but we look at this as a percentage of overall budget, of the project, and we looked at it as in terms of number of hours that they put into this. Is that even acceptable to do or to request from them? We said, the scope of the project hasn't changed. So CT consultants thought they had put X amount of time into a $9 million project. That, in my mind, is it's still a similar amount of time that they're putting into an $18 million project. I'm just asking because it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that they're needing that much more time if the scope of the project is not really that much larger. Even though obviously you understand the percentage of dollars.
Yeah, we don't know what their sort of hourly breakdown is. That's not something they give us. The whole sort of world rotates around that percentage. I would love for there to be some hours, and that would give me a metric to say, like, you thought you're going to use 1,000 hours, you're at 1,200 hours, these two numbers tie together, this makes sense. I totally understand why you would like that. I would love that. Unfortunately, Chuck is smiling at me, that's not the way these firms work.
It's not the way architects work.
But it does seem reasonable that someone has, I have to believe they have hours somewhere that they're tracking, but we're not privy to those.
Thank you.
I think the contract says just a percentage basis of the completion, right?
Yeah, Mr. Zippel, Mr. Epnick, the contract is a percentage, so we've already agreed to that percentage, standard AIA contract. And that's the way that
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, Mr. Swanson, the contract is a percentage, so it's a standard, these AIA contracts, which are architectural design contracts, if you will, kind of a standard form. We did make a lot of revisions and changes to it to protect ourselves. But the way it's stated in 11.6 is compensation identified is a percentage basis, so payments are made on a percentage. Mr. Zippel indicated that's the way these contracts are typically. They don't, for instance, and there was no means by which for us, when we were negotiating the contract at the outset of it, that we would even think that an hourly rate would be feasible, because then as you might suspect, that could go far above, and far beyond, because we don't have the means by which to really watch them with hourly meetings.
So one could conclude from what you just said then, that we have a legal obligation, contractual obligation to move to that percentage. That's an industry standard. Is that right? Or am I misunderstanding?
Well, in part, yes, but we wrote into the contract in section 9.5, we can terminate this for any reason we want, without cause, subject, of course, to them being paid for work already performed.
I think there is also, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a section that says this is a flat fee. And there's a separate line on it, and essentially is, the number was derived with a percentage, but this is the do not exceed number.
And that's what they're basing their percentage of invoicing on.
Yes.
So they estimate how complete they are with the design work, and they send an invoice based upon 85% complete of whatever the dollar amount is, and then the difference from what they've already been paid is what their invoice is for the month.
So what are those numbers?
You get 900 something was for the contract amount for the design, wasn't it?
Yes,
I that in your briefing paper, 928 or something.
It was not, I thought it was 980 something, 955, 704 was for the A&E, which is architecture and engineering, and the, I forgot the number. And the construction end was 253, 115.
So what you showed on your sheet there before was that they were getting 12% of the construction cost when they first wrote the contract, thinking it was a $10 million project. Now it's a $20 million project, let's say, and they're saying we only want 8%. We'll take it, our fee will be 8% of it. Where they, in my mind, if it would have been a project that I was working on, I would have said, hey, it's a renovation project, I gotta get the 13%, because that's really where the amount of effort is gonna be at it. So they're, in my mind, they're giving us a reduction in what their fee is, probably just to match whatever they expect their costs are gonna be at the end, plus a little bit of profit, some profit.
That's helpful, thank you.
Any other comments or questions for Ben? At this time, is there a motion to approve the resolution authorizing the CEO or his designee to increase the amount of the contract between R.L. Bowen and LakeTran by a total amount of $250,000 for a contract value not to exceed $1,458,819?
I'll make that motion.
Motion made by Mr. Zibble. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Ms. McNamee. Vicky, if you can please call the roll.
Epic,
No.
Martin,
No.
McNamee,
Yes.
Nunnally,
No.
Sheets,
No.
Swanson,
No.
Zibble.
Yes.
At this time, that did not pass. Turning the meeting back over to Ben for the 6-month look ahead.
Certainly. So, right stage here.